All right, let's go ahead and start. I'm John Hinderaker, and Bill Glahn is the man of the hour today. Bill has been following the Feeding Our Future scandal from the beginning. His reporting, I would say, has done more than anything else to drive the story, to drive the overall reporting and understanding of what's happened with this really kind of astonishing Minnesota scandal. So Bill Glahn, before I go to that, let me just say that we are going to do questions and answers in this session. There's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's also a chat tab. Don't use that. Use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And if questions occur to you, just go ahead and type them in. I'm going to be monitoring those and questions that seem to me to be good for an immediate follow-up, clarification or follow-up on something that Bill is saying. I may ask, right there on the spot, and otherwise we'll defer questions until the end. So as questions occur to you, go ahead and just type them in that, use that Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen to do that, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So with that prelude, Bill, we've just seen announced by the U.S. Attorney's Office the third round of indictments in the Feeding Our Future fraud. What's new here?
Well, what's new is the U.S. Attorney for the District of Minnesota, Andy Lugar, announced the third batch of indictments in the Feeding Our Future case. And so 10 more defendants were added to the list, bringing the total number up to 70. And of those 70, and I guess since we've been doing this for a couple of years, we've actually had one expire. One person died of natural causes. So we're down to 69 defendants. 17 have already pled guilty. And one of the batch of 10 that was just announced earlier this month is expected to plead guilty, and a guilty plea hearing has been scheduled for April in her case. So we're up to 70 defendants, less the one who died of natural causes. And we expect some trials to begin, perhaps as early as late March, early April, for the first couple batches of defendants. And just for some context, to reel this back, we're talking about a scandal involving a couple of federally funded food programs aimed at mostly children or disabled adults, but mostly children, to provide free food. And the State Department of Education is the agent for the federal government here in Minnesota. And the origins of this case go back to the beginning of the COVID years, where these programs were expanded and some of the rules were relaxed, and some fraudsters took advantage of that to steal. It's been estimated by the U.S. Attorney at a minimum $250 million. I've estimated the total is probably closer to $500 million that were stolen. And the U.S. Attorney, in conjunction with the FBI, conducted a series of raids a little over 2 years ago, early 2022, on some of what would later become defendants in the case. And that really kicked off the scandal. And so we've been doing this for 2 years. The first indictments happened about a year and a half ago. The last batch of indictments happened last March, and here we are with the third batch of indictments. And again, we expect some trials to begin later in the spring and stretching out into maybe early 2025 when the trials begin, probably more guilty pleas along the way. But it's been said, it's been reported that of its kind, this is one of the largest COVID-related frauds in America. And it happened here in Minnesota.
Well, I should hope it's one of the largest. It's somewhere between 250 million and 500 million dollars. But let's talk a little bit more about this third round of indictments that have just come down. You say there's 10 people involved. What's happening here? Is the U.S. Attorney's Office, are they working their way down the list so that, the $3 million defendants have been indicted, then they go to the $2 million, so that they're getting to a little bit smaller fish? Is that happening? Or another question in my mind, there are actually two different umbrella groups that were involved in this fraud. One of them was Feeding Our Future, and everybody calls it the Feeding Our Future scandal. But there was actually a second umbrella group called, I think, Partners in Nutrition or something like that. And have they gotten into the Partners in Nutrition part of the fraud, or what can we say about these latest 10 indictments? How do they fit?
Well, they're 10 individuals, and I'll break it down into three groups. There is one individual who's at the center of the larger group, and her name is Ikram Mohammed, and she has been indicted along with a half dozen of her relatives, siblings, husbands, people who are directly related to her. And she has been reported, and in these indictments and in the press, as a former employee of Feeding Our Future. So she was an insider. I don't know if she was a W-2 or a 1099 employee, exactly what the relationship was, but she's been reported as one of the insiders. And in fact, in one of the very first indictments handed down by the U.S. attorney, she was mentioned not by name, but by initials. And the indictment goes into some length of describing her relationship to some of the other people who have been indicted previously, and again with her group of cohorts. And from memory, it's about $10-12 million at that group. So I'm not sure it's so much working down the dollar amounts. Is think of it as a spider web, and we started out in the middle of it and we're extending out to the edges of the spider web. But you brought up a good point about this other group, Partners in Nutrition, also known as Partners in Quality Care. This was another large nonprofit network working these food programs about the same size as Feeding Our Future. And unlike Feeding Our Future, none of the people, none of the board members, none of the employees of Partners in Nutrition has ever been indicted. But a lot of the people who have been indicted, those 69 remaining defendants, had done business with Partners in Nutrition. In fact, some of them had only done business with Partners in Nutrition. But they don't get as much attention because they weren't among the first batch of indictments. And it's interesting that they've also gone out of business, along with Feeding Our Future. Some of the other nonprofits who haven't been implicated in this have gone out of business. The Department of Education took a very hard stand, unlike their previous stands in this case, that once those first search warrants happened or were executed back in January of 2022, they went and wholesale stopped payments on dozens and dozens of invoices worth millions and millions of dollars, which brought a lot of business, perhaps some of it legitimate, to a halt through these programs. But that was one group of 7 in this group of 10 indictments that this insider and her immediate family were accused of bilking it for an 8-figure sum. There was a couple indicted in this round who run a grocery store in South Minneapolis called Evergreen Grocery. They've been accused of taking $4 million plus out of it. Apparently none of the money ever went into renovating their store. I put up a picture I took of the place last summer. And a lot of their money went overseas. People ask about the swag. You know, they were spending money on Burberry and Louis Vuitton and Canada Goose.
Hey, let me just stop you for a second. I want to interrupt the swag story, which is always interesting, but I'm just thinking about this. So you're talking about a little grocery store somewhere in the city of Minneapolis. Is that right?
Nicollet Avenue, on Nicollet Avenue.
On Nicollet Avenue. And $4 million apparently was, or allegedly was, stolen in Feeding Our Future money through this little grocery store somewhere on Nicollet Avenue in South Minneapolis, right?
Well, what's amazing to me about this grocery store is, and I put that picture up on our website, is that this grocery store was one of half a dozen applicants for sites that the Department of Education denied back in April of 2020. So, and these half dozen applications that they denied, the proprietors have all been indicted, including this last couple. So the Department of Education knew from day zero who is going to commit the fraud. They got these applications in, they said no, and the Feeding Our Future threatened to sue. And so they relented. They were accused of being racist. Department of Education granted these applications. They took allegedly $4 million out of the program. And then late October of 2020, unilaterally, the Department of Education threw them out of the program, threw this grocery and half a dozen other sites out of the program. They knew who was doing the fraud. They've known all along who was doing the fraud, but they didn't have the courage of their convictions. So when they were accused of racist, when Feeding Our Future lawyered up and took them to federal court, they just threw up their hands and said, let this be the FBI's problem.
Well, it wasn't their money. Isn't that part of the story, Bill? I
Right.
mean, they knew who the fraudsters were. They knew that many, many, many millions of dollars were flying out the window. They got bullied. They got sued by Feeding Our Future. Feeding Our Future's lawyer bullied them in court. And instead of aggressively and vigorously standing up for what they knew was right, they folded. Isn't that a fair summary of how
That's
that
my
happened?
reading of it. My reading of it
And,
is
and,
they got out lawyered, they got accused of racism, and as we reported on these webinars before, a lot of prominent politicians in Minneapolis and St. Paul went to bat for these groups and said, "Hey, you're being unfair. You need to ease up." And then they responded not just to the legal pressure, but some of the political pressure that was on them. And it's interesting, I'll repeat myself. So as soon as the FBI executed those search warrants, they turned the spigot off, no more. And so they got sued over that, and then all of a sudden they've got a spine, a steel, and they've relented and never given out another, or they haven't relented, never given out another dime.
so the point I would make about that, Bill, is that if this had been their $500 million,
Right.
if this was a private company or if this was an individual and it was your money, they wouldn't have crumbled. They wouldn't have thrown up their hands. They wouldn't have
Right.
surrendered just because Feeding Our Future went out and got an aggressive lawyer. You wouldn't do that if it was your money. But I can't help thinking that one of the lessons of this whole scandal is, it's foolish for us taxpayers to believe that the government is going to safeguard our money and be a watchdog over our money the same way they would if it was their money, or the way we would if it's our money. Isn't that right, Bill? To me, that's
Right.
a big picture lesson of this whole
Right.
story.
And we'll get later on in the webinar into the Office of Legislative Auditor and the investigation they're conducting of the Department of Education. But I just wanted to close out this last group of defendants. So we had the group of 7 that was Feeding Our Future insider and her immediate family. We have this couple who ran Evergreen Grocery on Nicollet Avenue. Then we had a gal who runs a halal grocery store in Burnsville. And her indictment is different in that this is her prelude to pleading guilty. There's a guilty plea hearing scheduled for April in her case. And it's interesting, in her write-up and her indictment, they name half a dozen other co-conspirators, not by name, but by initials, and describe in great detail, naming names of these nonprofits. I did a series of posts on our website a year or two ago about Burnsville and all of these fake nonprofits that popped up in Burnsville, and this industrial site where a lot of automotive related businesses are located on Cliff Road, and how this place was supposedly feeding 8,000 kids a day, these nonprofits that had just started up a week before. And they, U.S. attorney in their spider web, drilling down, whatever metaphor we wanted to use, has finally gotten to this Burnsville operation, which is, again, a couple $1 million more that went out the door in what were obviously fake nonprofits and not bona fide food distribution sites. And this pre-guilty plea seems to indicate that we're going to have maybe another half dozen Burnsville-related indictments or charges down the road. But yes, let's get to the role later on of the Department of Education and their lack of effort in protecting your tax dollar, because I'm pretty sure, John, you're a federal taxpayer too.
Sad but true. Hey, a couple of things I want to follow up on, Bill. One of our viewers, Mark Luther, asked a good question. Why do you believe the actual fraud was more like 500 million than 250 million?
Right. So I did a fairly uh, detailed analysis of all of the people, all of the nonprofits who participated in the Feeding Our Future, and got some guesstimate of how much money was taken out of the program by Feeding Our Future, by the Partners in Nutrition Group. And some of these nonprofits got smart and they said, well, why should I pay Partners in Nutrition or Feeding Our Future 10 or 15% commission on this when I can just steal the money directly? And so some of these nonprofits who had been sites, subcontractors to these others, struck off on their own and cut out the middleman. And so I added together all the money the Department of Education paid out over those 2-year periods to people who had either been part of the Feeding Our Future or part of the Partners in Nutrition network or had spun off under their own network. And I got up to like $525 million. And we know that not all of this was a fraud. We know there was some food distributed, there were some bona fide, some daycares within these networks that really were feeding children and backed out into a number that I came up north of 500 million. So there was some analysis involved, some guesstimation involved, but as it turns out, as we get deeper and deeper into it, people who claim they had these massive feeding operations turned out to be 99% fake.
Well, in some cases, it was just ridiculous. The second floor, 1-bedroom apartment whose inhabitant claimed to be feeding thousands of children every day, apparently out of his kitchen or something. I don't know. But so I also want to follow up, Bill, because you were starting. This is something that's always interesting to people, right? What were these miscreants doing with their hundreds of millions of dollars in ill-gotten gains? And you were starting to list off some of the swag that has come to light, and I kind of shifted you in a different direction there. But let's go back to that. What have we learned about how these criminals were spending their loot?
I'm sure some sociologists could write a PhD thesis out of what people spend their money on when they steal it from the government. But all these brand names, I would mention this last batch spent money on Burberry, Louis Vuitton, Canada Goose, which goes well with the snowy scene behind you, John. And then vehicles, very popular. This is how I discovered you can spend $100,000 on a pickup truck, because they were buying these GMC Sierras, Ford F-150s, all tricked out with all of the options. Some luxury cars, not in this batch, but there was a gal who bought a Porsche SUV for the purpose of delivering food to poor children. That's what she claimed it was for. So I didn't buy it. My nonprofit bought it, and we're using it to make food deliveries. And then the grocer couple is accused of sending a lot of their money overseas. People have used money to buy residential, commercial properties in foreign countries, Bitcoin, or just ship it over to bank accounts outside the nation. There was one gal in a previous batch who tried to buy a single engine airplane. I don't think she was ever successful, but she put down a down payment on it. And again, this last
If
batch,
if you have to flee suddenly, Bill, a single engine airplane comes in handy.
well, and then boats, lots of residential real estate. The guy who used to work for Mayor Fry, he and a co-conspirator bought a small apartment building in South Minneapolis. But yeah, I've been interested in how the entrepreneurial spirit lives. So this last batch, one of the things they bought was a cargo van. And we had another batch where somebody bought a Freightliner over-the-road tractor for use in their trucking business. So they were trying to take this money to make more money. And then, a lot of the people were living in homes they had purchased with stolen money, or commercial real estate in Minneapolis. They had bought the office building they had been tenants in. They bought the office building. And so it just runs the gamut. And then, of course, Las Vegas junkets, luxury rental cars, the usual things people waste money on when they're just so people ask, and I anticipate one of the questions is, have they gotten any of the money back? But if you're staying at the Luxor in Las Vegas and you're renting a Rolls Royce, we're never clawing that money back.
Right. So here's a question that I'm sure many people have wondered about. I know I have. Brahim Zabeli, if I'm reading that correctly, asks, where is or was the state of Minnesota, particularly the Attorney General's office, in the investigation and prosecution of this case? Because as we all know, this has been driven by the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're the ones that have just announced this third round of indictments. So, good question. Where were the Minnesota authorities in this case?
It's very weird. And I'm not a lawyer, you're a lawyer, but I don't quite understand the different jurisdictions. So we have the State Attorney General, Keith Ellison, announced a few weeks ago a big Medicaid prosecution. So he's prosecuting Minnesota residents who built, allegedly, a federal government healthcare program, Medicaid. And so this is a federal government program run through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And for whatever reason, the State Department of Education has taken the position they can't get involved in any kind of investigation. They're not an investigation agency. And the state attorney general has deferred all of the criminal cases to the U.S. attorney. Now, the state attorney general has gone off after some of these nonprofits in civil cases. He's filed a number of cases in state court to either shut down these nonprofits, revoke their operating charters. In some cases, he's clawed back modest amounts of money through the civil process. I'm not quite sure the division of labor here, and I don't know if we'll get into this much, but it's been interesting that Keith Ellison and his son, who's a city councilman on the Minneapolis City Council, are both the recipients of fairly significant campaign donations by the fraudsters. And, again, it's interesting. I don't know if it's influenced, it's hard to say. Politicians get money from lots of donors they've never met, have no contact with them, but I've found these connections.
You certainly can't indict a politician simply because somebody gave him money. Most of the time, they have no idea who these people are giving them money. It does seem, though, that these fraudsters had a pretty good idea of which politicians they wanted to support. I'll hazard a wild guess that we weren't seeing the fraudsters' donations divided equally between the Democrats and the Republicans. Is that a fair guess?
That is a fair guess. I have searched all 70 names through all the campaign finance databases, either the national ones or the Minnesota ones. I have not been able to find a donation to a Republican.
And I guess we can make of that what we will. And here's another question that has I know people have wondered about, and I've wondered about. When you just look at the names of the people who are being indicted, pleading guilty, whatever, obviously many of them are African names. My understanding is that this scandal was centered largely in the Somali community here in the Twin Cities. Is that right? Or how would you describe that situation?
Yeah, I would say it's at least 90% of the 70 who have been indicted, you could fairly describe as being of Somali ethnicity. And, again, I came up with that number of $500 million of total fraud. I've also estimated there's probably 200 to 300 individuals who were involved in this scandal when you reach out to the farthest edge of it. And it's been estimated there's something like 80,000 Somalis living in Minnesota. So we're talking a very tiny fraction of a population. Amy Bach, who's been the face of the scandal, is not Somali. There was a gal who pled guilty here fairly recently, I think it was last month, who is African-American from longstanding stock. But most of it's been Somali. But I should hasten to add that I've gotten a lot of anonymous tips and a lot of inside information fed to me over these last 2 years that I've been covering this. And a lot of it has come from people who are also inside the Somali community. So we name dozens and dozens of defendants and a couple hundred more who might be implicated, but there are thousands and thousands of others who are as appalled as we are at this. They were the ones who saw people in their community driving brand new Mercedes, buying mansions on lakes, flouting their newfound wealth on social media, Facebook, whatever. And they were the ones tipping off the FBI. They're the ones tipping off the Department of Education. They've come and met with us in our offices to share what they know. So you say, yes, most of them are Somalis, but I would say the Somalia community writ whole has had the same reaction that you and I and our viewers have had to this scandal. They're appalled by it. It's their tax dollars too.
Well, that's a great point, Bill. I'm glad to bring that out. So looking at the big picture here, I think you said 70 people so far have been indicted. There's other names or initials, that have cropped up. They're obviously on somebody's radar. I think you indicated that indications, based on what's been made public, is there's another 200 or 300 people that seemingly were involved in this scandal in some way. Where do you think we are in this process? I mean, it's been going on for a couple of years. I don't know offhand what the statute of limitations is, but at some point, they've got to shut it down. I mean, do you think there's a lot more people yet to be indicted, or do you think we're nearing the end of the process?
Yeah, I just guesstimating probably about halfway through. So there are going to be people who benefited from this, took money out of these programs, who are never going to see the inside of a courtroom. It's just the U.S. attorney has impressive resources, but they are finite. They don't have hundreds of people to throw at this. They have other crimes, carjackings, terrorism that they're trying to pursue. So and he's
Arson in a few
arson,
instances.
to name one. But the U.S. attorney has been very careful. Every time there's been one of these rounds of indictments, he always says 250 million is the floor, not the ceiling of this. There will be more indictments. Every time he announces a group of indictments, he says there will be more indictments. I'm guessing we're about halfway through. We talked about this other nonprofit who was as big dollar-wise as Feeding Our Future, and we really haven't gotten too much into them. So,
That's
we
the
could,
Partners in Nutrition group.
right. So if Partners in Nutrition is the focus of it, there's a couple others that are not quite as big a scale that have so far not received a lot of attention from the U.S. attorney. So maybe we will see that number of defendants double over time, probably not triple. And it'd be interesting to see if the pace picks up after these trials, that once he's established a few guilty verdicts, whether he'll start accelerating the process. But just knowing the universe of people out there and the dollars involved, I'd say probably about halfway through.
So one question I'm sure is on the minds of a lot of our viewers today, Bill. Apparently, the first jury trials have not yet taken place, will be coming up very shortly, but a number of people have pled guilty, right? I mean, this has been going on for a while, and I'm guessing most of these people ultimately have pled guilty. I mean, they've obviously got the goods on them, right? And so I think one basic question is, what's happening to the people who plead guilty? Are they getting seriously punished, or a slap on the wrist, or, what kind of sentences have we been seeing?
Well, we haven't seen any sentences yet. The first guilty pleas came in a year and a half ago. The first guilty pleas came in with the first batch of indictments, and there still have not been any sentencing hearings held. I don't know if they're waiting for these trials to occur and seeing what cooperation, if any, these defendants offer that process, but we haven't seen any sentences. Behind the scenes, and I know we'll get to this a little later, behind the scenes, there's been a lot of activity through the U.S. Attorney's Office and U.S. Marshals in seizing some of the ill-gotten gains, the forfeitures. So there have been filings about, I mentioned that office building on Lake Street that was seized. Some of the fraudsters were tenants in this building. They bought the building and the building next door, and the federal government seized that and sold it off to some new buyer, retrieved a couple of $1 million to offset the fraud. Some of these residential properties have been seized and sold off, and some money is recovered. And there have been millions of dollars in bank accounts that were seized as part of the searches.
So Bill, this is a question that I know one of our viewers asked earlier, and it's been on my mind. Do you have, or has anybody tried to put together, or is there any way to put together a total figure for how much of this $200 to $500 million the Feds so far have actually been able to claw back?
Well, I have found some filings where they've talked about a transaction here or a bank account seized there. And just my back of the envelope calculation, it looks like recoveries so far have been in the tens of millions, whereas the fraud is in the hundreds of millions. So we have hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud, and they've clawed back tens of millions. I don't know if that's 20 or 40 or 60 million that they've clawed back and have in hand. But it's interesting, every time there is a guilty plea, they have a forfeiture entered against that defendant for whatever dollar amount the U.S. attorney believes they took. What percentage of that they're going to claw back, I have no idea. If the money was spent on a Canada Goose down coat, what's that worth used? Or a Ford F-150 that's got 20,000 miles on it, it's no longer showroom quality. The money that went overseas, the money that went into Bitcoin, I despaired ever clawing back. maybe we'll get 50 cents on the dollar when it's all said and done. Maybe not.
Yeah, I'd be shocked if it's anywhere near 50 cents on the dollar, but I do think it's fair to say that the feds have made a legitimate, serious effort to try to recover this money, and I applaud them for that. They're never going to get 50 cents on the dollar, but they're getting significant amounts of money, and I think they should get some credit for that. Another question that I know, or a series of questions that I know people have got about this, a number of these defendants have fled overseas, haven't they? I mean, one, if you know that the FBI is about to ring your doorbell, one thing you can do is buy a plane ticket, right? You go to Kenya or Somalia or wherever it might be. Do we have a sense, Bill, or do you have a sense of how many of these 200 or 300 people that we think are involved in this thing have flown the coop successfully?
Well, that's interesting. I don't have a number, but I have an inkling that one of the reasons why we haven't seen more individuals indicted is because they're not in America. What's the point of going through the process when you're not going to have a human being to put in front of a judge? We had a number of people who have been indicted in absentia. These were people who were fairly integral to the fraud, and it's tough to tell the story of the fraud without telling their story. So they're useful even though they're not in the country. But as soon as those, and I think probably even before those search warrants were executed in January of 2022, people left the country and they're never coming back. That they had moved the money over and they had lives overseas and they got out before anybody went looking for them. It's interesting, at least 3 or 4 of the defendants who have been active in the process were arrested in the process of fleeing the country. One was in a
Like
jetway
at
at
the
the
airport.
airport.
Yeah,
Another
yeah.
one was at O'Hare looking to get on a plane to Istanbul. So there were people who tried to flee the country and they were able to grab them before that happened. But there are others who have been indicted we'll never see again. And I suspect people who should have been indicted, who got out while the getting was good, that we'll never hear of.
And that raises the kind of a related question that I know a lot of people have asked about, wondered about. We've seen, I believe, several instances where people who are under indictment, who are criminal defendants in this matter, have gotten permission from the court to travel overseas for one reason or another, going to Kenya, going to Somalia, going somewhere. And I know a lot of people in Minnesota have said, well, we're never going to see that guy again, right? Once he gets out of the country. What can you tell us about this, Bill?
Well, the Star Tribune actually did some good work. So the Star Tribune dug into this and found out of the 70 defendants, a couple of dozen have left the state at one time or another. A couple of them have just relocated elsewhere. One guy moved down to Texas to find a job. But again, there's been a double-digit number of these defendants who have gotten permission to travel overseas. And it's interesting, I was reading about one a couple of days ago who got permission from a federal judge to make his second overseas trip since he was indicted. He had made one some months ago and had returned and used that as, hey, look, you let me go and I came back and now I want to spend another 5 weeks in Turkey. And the court said, okie doke. So again, it's not the first trip, the second trip, the fifth trip, the eighth trip, but it's that 10th trip that they don't come back from is the scary part. And with a lot of these defendants having moved money abroad that the FBI knows about or having family abroad. And the other thing I'm amazed at, a lot of these defendants plead poverty. Oh, the feds took my bank accounts. The feds took my house. I don't have 2 nickels to rub together. I need a public defender. But yes, I'm going to spend 6 weeks visiting 3 continents. Could you give me my passport back? So I can't afford to travel to 3 continents and spend 6 weeks abroad. But a lot of these defendants have the wherewithal to do that. And again, I don't have any evidence that I can say for sure somebody's been allowed to travel overseas by a judge and has not returned. But it just seems like the more it happens, the more somebody's just going to decide it's not worth it for them to come back.
Well, it's gonna increase my opinion of human nature if it turns out that all these people who get permission to leave the country actually do return to be tried and sentenced. Speaking of trying and sentencing, you mentioned that the first jury trials are finally coming around on the schedule in the next month or two. And that's interesting in a number of ways. For one thing, what are the defenses? These defendants, most of them, I take it, are pleading guilty, although I'm surprised to learn that over a year and a half, none of them have been sentenced. That seems weird to me. But the ones who are sticking it out and willing to go in front of a jury, what defenses are they asserting?
Well, it's interesting. There was a lot of people who were interviewed before there were any indictments, and the lawyers who are advising these folks have given them good advice, and for the most part, they've all clammed up. They lawyered up and won't make statements in the press. One exception is Amy Bach, the lead defendant, defendant number one in the case. She has pled not guilty, and she has been interviewed by the media. She has filed pro se. She's her own lawyer in one of these civil cases I mentioned earlier that the attorney general is pursuing. And her view is that she's an unwitting dupe in all of this, that she was the founder and CEO of this $200 million a year operation, Feeding Our Future, but that she had no idea that her employees and her vendors were in this elaborate scheme to defraud the government. This was all news to her. She had done her due diligence. She had done her best, but somehow some fraud slipped through, and none of it's her fault. So that's a synopsis of her view. And
Isn't
some
it
of
at
the,
least alleged that she was getting kickbacks from all these people? That if you wanted to get on the gravy train, you had to cut her in?
that's what the U.S. attorney has filed in her indictment, that she profited directly from this to the tune of several $100,000, and they have the receipts. But she claims those were unrelated transactions and had nothing to do with the food fraud. And she's going to go with a defense and go to trial. A lot of the other defendants have made filings. They've asked for a change of venue. They've asked for all kinds of evidence to be suppressed. And the implications are that the U.S. Attorney, the FBI, the Department of Education, all these have a racist animus against them and their clients, that they were feeding hungry minority children, hungry immigrant children, and the evil state and federal governments cut off the money and are trying to put them in jail for it. So they're going with playing the race card. And then they also have this, it was all legitimate, and we were feeding all those children, and we were just extremely good businessmen, and almost all of them are men. The majority of the defendants are men. We were extremely good businessmen, and we're able to, in a program that reimburses recipients $1 to $3, depending on the meal, that the middleman takes 10 or 15% out of that $1 to $3, but yet they were able to produce profit margins, producing hundreds of millions of dollars of profit on hundreds of millions of dollars of reimbursements. So their claim is they're just really good at this, and people are jealous, or people hate them because they're racist or something like that. They're pleading innocence. Said, "Oh, we really fed all those kids."
And I think that some defendants have, I think you mentioned this, are moving for a change of venue, which is interesting to me. What's the rationale for that, and where do they want their case to go?
Well, they want their case to go to Chicago, to the Northern District of Illinois, presumably because people in Chicago wouldn't look askance at something like this, that this would be something that they wouldn't convict on. Uh, Again, there are lots of districts between here and the District of Illinois that gets them out of the District of Minnesota, but that's where they've asked. I don't think they're going to get that change of venue. I think they've already, at least preliminarily, been told no. But pre-trial publicity is one of the things. And again, in my view of the world, there hasn't been enough publicity. There hasn't been enough media coverage given the scope.
Word for you, Bill, there would have been very little.
But in fact, one of the pieces I wrote was in an exhibit. They show, look at all this publicity. But I don't know how many readers I had for that particular post, but they think they can't get a fair shake. You think of the Derek Chauvin, George Floyd defendants. They couldn't get a change of venue, but they pled for a change of venue based on pretrial publicity and the fact that the locals have it in for them. And I don't think they're going to get granted. But again, they're got good lawyers working for them, just as they always have, and trying to get evidence suppressed and charges thrown out, and we'll see how it goes.
One of our viewers asks a question that I know has been asked by many since this whole scandal began. He asks, have any state staff been implicated? And I would maybe broaden that question. Beyond being implicated as actually participating in the fraud, has there been any accountability at the Minnesota Department of Education for allowing this to happen?
Short answers are no and no. So in all of my searching, those 200 to 300 individuals that I've mentioned, none of them are employees of state government. I haven't found any connection where they had an insider in state government that was helping them. In fact, more like the opposite's true, that there were lots of employees of the Department of Education who tried to do their due diligence. It was interesting. Amy Bach was saying she has all these emails where she's inviting people to come and look at her operation to see all the hungry children being fed. But one instance I could find where somebody from the department actually did show up unannounced on a Saturday. By Monday morning, Amy Bach was in court looking for an injunction to keep the Department of Education from ever visiting one of her sites unannounced. So I don't know that anybody in the department, but again, they knew, as I documented, who these people were. They knew their names, they knew their addresses, but when push came to shove, they just let it happen and $500 million went out the door. There is an investigation that the legislative auditor, not an auditor in the executive branch, but an auditor in the legislative branch, has been looking at how the department handled this. And they've been conducting this investigation from day one. For 2 years, they've been conducting this investigation. A report was supposed to have come out last year. Now they're saying maybe next month. So maybe we'll do another webinar next month. Maybe in March, they'll put out this report, or at least sometime while the legislature is in session, that goes and documents what the department did and didn't do to prevent this scandal from happening.
Well, again, not to belabor the point, Bill, but I come back to the fact, if this was a private business and people, employees in a company, allowed $500 million to just kind of float out the door inadvertently because they got fooled or defrauded or overcharged or weren't paying attention, there would be accountability for that. I mean, at a bare minimum, the employees in that situation are going to lose their jobs. I mean, if nothing worse. And it's kind of appalling to me that our expectations of state government are so low that, you know, in many people's eyes, it seems to be okay if state employees just allow a $500 million in taxpayer money to just kind of drift out the door. And
Well,
we'll see.
it's even worse, John. So in 2023, we talk frequently about the trifecta. The DFL has complete control of state government. And instead of conducting oversight hearings, when Republicans still had the state Senate, they conducted oversight hearings of the Department of Education in this scandal. They had cabinet level, sub-cabinet level officials come in and try to explain themselves, which to my mind, they actually didn't succeed. But they did some real due diligence, some real independent investigation of the executive branch, as you would expect an oversight to occur in the legislative branch. But they lost by 1 seat control of the state Senate. Since Democrats took full control, not one hearing in the legislature on the scandal, not one person called to testify. What Democrats did in this last go around was add more employees they didn't fire anybody, they added more employees. Well, we need an inspector general. We need more people to go and inspect these sites. We need more bodies on the ground in order to conduct or enforce the laws we thought they were enforcing all along. But they've had, if anything has happened, probably people got promoted to oversee all these new employees they hired.
So I got one more question I want to cover, Bill, one more kind of bigger picture topic. And then let's go to the questions. We got a bunch of questions our viewers have been asking, and we'll do kind of a lightning round. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can. But the last thing I want to ask you, Bill, is how are there connections between this food scandal, the Feeding Our Future scandal, and other government fraud scandals that we've seen here in Minnesota?
Well, the answer is definitely yes. One of the 70 defendants was actually indicted separately with a different group in a Medicaid fraud indictment. So she has two different federal cases pending involving stealing money from two different federal programs. So that's documented. And then I and other people, Sahan Journal, Minnesota Reformer, the Star Tribune, have documented how many of these defendants had the food sites, but they also ran daycares, adult daycares, child daycares, adult daycares, personal care assistant businesses, autism clinics, other businesses that they owned that also take millions and millions of dollars out of different federal programs. And so there have been efforts to, can we shut down some of these other businesses that may not be legitimate? We don't know. One of this last batch of defendants, one of the relatives of this Ikram Mohammed, he owns a personal care assistant business that takes something like $8 million out of the Department of Human Services every year, a different operation than the Department of Education. But a lot of these, and then people who have already pled guilty, also had daycares and other businesses where they were getting state money, again, out of different programs, out of different agencies.
Now, are they still getting that money from different agencies after they have pled guilty in Feeding Our Future?
The short answer is yes. And the longer answer is the state government has taken the position, and I don't know what legal basis this is, that just because you have admitted in court and been convicted of defrauding one federal program, we can't automatically bar you from a different federal program. That the other federal program has its own process for removing participants, and we have to follow all the due process of allowing them to defend themselves. Well, my childcare was completely legitimate. Maybe I pled guilty to this food thing, but don't shut down my childcare.
Well, I would say, yes, you can do that. I mean, every one of these agencies has got its own standards for eligibility. And there's no reason they can't promulgate a rule that says that if you've defrauded another federal or state welfare program, you're not eligible to participate in ours. I mean, I'm shocked that they don't already have those rules in effect. I mean, again, it's somebody else's money. I think that's the bottom line. I'm happy to see as I go through these questions that a lot of them we have addressed, we have answered. Let's get to a few more. One of our viewers asks, are you going to talk about the recent Amy Bach filing in the Minnesota Department of Education versus Feeding Our Future / Amy Bach case, implicating MDE in trying to hide information from data practices? I don't understand that question really, but do you, Bill? Do you know what's referred to?
So I mentioned this case. The Department of Education got humiliated by Amy Bach and her lawyers in litigation over the years, and ex post trying to claw back some of the cost of that litigation. So they claim the state taxpayers were on the hook for $500,000 in cases they lost in civil court to Amy Bach and Feeding Our Future. And so Amy Bach, again, her bank accounts and her home were seized by the feds. She's representing herself in this lawsuit. So she filed on her own behalf an answer in this lawsuit, turning it back around and filing her own counterclaims against MDE for emotional distress and, I don't know, slander or whatever her claims were. But in the claim, she has some evidence where she asked for data under the Data Practices Act from the Department of Education and found evidence that they were trying to hide information from these searches by intentionally misspelling words and using code words to try to keep from having to answer data practices requests in her case. There's plenty of blame to go around. As I've mentioned, the Department of Education has not yet answered for why $500 million went out the door on their watch when they knew before it started who was doing it. But again, Amy Bach is under indictment with a number of federal charges, will go to trial, is representing herself. I take everything that she says with a grain of salt.
So another viewer wants to know, why are the initials of people involved being used instead of their full name? Is that to protect those people, or why this practice of identifying? And I know you've done a lot of sleuth work, and in many cases you've figured out who the initials are, but why do they do it that way?
Yeah, so when somebody is said they were the CEO of Youth International Club, LLC, or something like that, initials AB, I'm making all this up. But yeah, you can just go on the Secretary of State's website and find out who AB is. So they're not really hiding it. I'm guessing it's some sort of rule in the U.S. Attorney's Office or the Department of Justice. If they haven't actually charged anybody with a crime, then and may not at any point, then they don't name them with the full name. So that's just a guess.
Let's see. Let's try to take a couple more questions here before we stop. One of our viewers makes an observation that ties in with something you've already said, but maybe could be elaborated on a little bit more. She says it seems like it follows the daycare scandal as to the perpetrators. A lot of people don't know or don't remember, Bill, that some years ago now, there were a bunch of indictments here in Minnesota for fraud in daycare. And again, unfortunately, and unfortunately, a lot of those indictments did arise out of the Somali community here. And what was happening, as I recall, was that people would set up daycares and there were fictitious kids, supposedly being cared for in these facilities that didn't really exist. And there were a number of criminal prosecutions. This goes back, 5 years or more ago, I would say, more than that now. There are a number of successful criminal prosecutions. So is there a relationship there? Are we seeing some of the same people, some of the same techniques? This fraud is something that's been going on for a while.
Yes. So some of the same people. I don't think there's anybody in this batch of 70 that was previously indicted on a child care fraud. So it's not the same individuals, but it's the same pattern where they had fake kids, they were billing for kids who either didn't exist or never showed up to daycare. And it's interesting to see some of these defendants. I go through the corporate databases and find out they are very entrepreneurial. That maybe they owned a grocery store or maybe they owned a restaurant, but they also owned a daycare business, an adult daycare business. They owned a personal care attendant business. I just saw something in the New York Post about how in New York State is ripe with fraud with this. You pay people to sit with disabled folk or old folk. It's a lifeline for a lot of people. It's something that keeps them independent and out of nursing homes. So it's an important federal program, but it's easy to say, yeah, I stayed for 2 hours, but I billed for 10. And that program has had problems over the years where people billed for 80 hours in a day. I'm making that up, but it was more than 24 hours a day. They actually had to write into the software that you couldn't bill for more than 24 hours in a single calendar day, just because people were abusing it. And so it seems clear. Oh, trucking companies. I'm not quite sure what the relationship is to trucking companies, but the pattern is that they get money out of this program from this agency, a different program from a different agency, and pretty soon it adds together in real money. But yeah, there were a lot of people who were indicted and convicted of defrauding the child care program. And it looked like it was going to go into a bigger scandal. And there were some news reports that it was $100 million scandal. And then the state government and everybody was, oh no, we have no proof of that. That hasn't been proven. And it turned out that there was a senior official in the Department of Human Services who actively shut down any state investigation of the program. Not only did she not get fired, she got promoted to a higher position there. She's still on the payroll now. So it's one thing to turn a blind eye, but it's another thing to actively shut down investigations of stuff for which they already had dozens of convictions.
So one of our viewers has a question that I think is in jest, but I'll ask it anyway. Um, the fugitives who have fled, do we have records of them voting absentee?
I have not checked. I have not checked. Again, that's on my list of things to do because we're laughing, but there was the somebody who committed a violent crime down in Texas recently was found to be A, an illegal immigrant, and B, to have voted in the 2020 election. So I'm not discounting it, but I have not. I have the database. I have not checked it.
So one last question, and I think we have to call it quits. And this is a technical question that harkens back to how the fraud was perpetrated. But Alan Mello asks, why was the money paid out not reconciled to the actual food being provided / shipped out? What happened to the food? That's a good question. I mean, was there a parallel set of records that would be provided to the Department of Education that would document enormous amounts of food being bought, being paid for, being shipped, going to certain locations, being consumed by children? I mean, where was that paper trail?
It exists. It exists. And you read the indictments from the U.S. attorney, and a lot of the people indicted were people who didn't participate directly in the food program, but people who were allegedly food vendors, people who had started businesses where they were supposedly providing millions of dollars worth of food. The food never existed. There was no food. All there were fake invoices. And
So
so
part of the fraud is that somebody who would have been in the business of selling food would just create a fake invoice for 50,000 lunches, it's so many $1 million, and send it and collect for it.
right. And part of the problem has to do with some of the intricacies of the federal rules that govern these programs. And if a nonprofit submits an invoice, then the clock starts and the agency has only so many days whether either to pay it out or dispute it. So they were just paying out the invoices, and then ex post, either they and or the FBI has gone back. So, well, show me your invoices, and either there weren't any, or the invoices didn't match the food count, and so they were required by federal law to not just keep a log of all the kids that were fed, but keep a log of all the food that they bought to feed them. And so it's interesting that once the search warrants were executed, all of a sudden the Department of Education got hyper literal in interpretation of these. And so they would stop paying invoices because the meal didn't include milk. And so, all of a sudden where they were just paying out invoices, no questions asked, that the bar became, 100 feet high in order to get your invoice paid.
Well, Bill, you've been the man on this story for a long time now, and the story isn't done. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens when these first cases start going to trial in a month or two. The people bold enough to actually plead not guilty and take their chances with the jury, and undoubtedly there are going to be some more indictments coming down as well. And so I foresee more Feeding Our Future updates in our future. And with that, I think we'll call today and thank all of our viewers for attending.